start by telling you guys first, I know I am really behind in grading, and I am behind in answering emails. We had an unexpected funeral in my family this week, and I had to travel up to Wisconsin. So I'm really going to try hard to be caught up tomorrow. Yeah, it was a sad thing, but so hopefully I'll be caught up on emails today, and then try to be caught up on grading by the end of the day Saturday. You guys are starting to read chapter 17 right now, which means you have 2 chapters left in the book, and you might think, oh, we have to finish e-Congress. And as of today, we're 2 months out, exactly 2 months out from the exam. So the exam is very early this year. And we're going to look at economic policy and foreign policy. So if you take a look at your schedule at where we are now, you're reading about economic policy this week, and we'll be on to talk about it next week and have an exam. And probably I need to look at, I'm hoping to have everything else opened for the rest of the year in the next day or 2 as well. So next week, economic policy, and perhaps we'll start reading foreign policy. I think we're on economic policy for 2 weeks before the spring break. So we come back from spring break, basically, have a week to finish that up, and then we've got some time that we have to do our e-Congress. And, the 6th of May is when the exam is. So, I like to have 2 full weeks of exam prep. That means we have to be done with all of our classwork, including e-Congress, by the 19th of April. That would give us the last week in April and first week in May to prep prior to that exam on Monday. The last week in March, the 25th through the 29th, is spring break. So just keep that in mind if you feel like, Mrs. Reed, why are we reading chapter 17 and it's only March 7th? It's really not that far away. And e-Congress can be a tricky part of class. It's fun and it's important, but doing all of the logistics of it can get a little bit tricky. So, but I do want to talk about local government. Now, your book deleted this chapter, so the lucky part for you is it's really just a conversation that we're going to have about it. It is on the exam. It does matter. We will come back to it, but you don't have a test on it, and I'm not going to write you a test on it. But it's important because we are a federal system of government, right? What does that mean, that we're federal? People say things like, oh, the feds, right? Well, what does federal actually mean? You can't be March 7th of AP US government and not be able to answer that question. Nobody? Nobody knows what federal is? It's actually not. It's the opposite of that, Zach. It means that federal means, as we looked at from the very beginning this year, guys, if you don't know this, you need to know this for the exam. It's very important. A federal system is different than a unitary system in that we have constitutionally shared powers, right? The United States government, the federal government, the national government doesn't have complete authority over the state government. Those are not devolved powers, like we're going to let the states do this and the local governments do this. The Constitution enumerates the powers that are given to the national government, and then all the other powers are supposed to be kept with the states, right? This is the big fight over the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, is how strong is the federal government going to be, the national government going to be. So federal in nature means that it's shared power. Our friends in the United Kingdom have what's called a unitary system of government. All constitutional power lies with Westminster in London. Does that mean they do everything? No. The Scottish Parliament does some things, and the Welsh Parliament does some things, but it's what's called devolved power, or the federal government, the national government gives them that power. In a federal system, those powers are constitutionally shared out. So the national government does not get to tell the states everything, right? The states have power constitutionally mandated on their own. Local governments do not have constitutional power. Our Constitution divides the power between the national level and the state level. That's what federal means. But we have powers that are devolved down to local levels. So, you know, we think of things like the president and the governor and those sorts of positions, and then we've got national legislatures and state legislatures, but really the people that are in your local communities running your local government, they're the people who have the most influence over your day-to-day life. You know, people watch the news and they think whoever is elected to president matters the most. Actually, who's in your township boards? Who's on your county commissioners? Who's in your, if you're run by a mayoral system and a town manager or a city council, who are those people? They're the ones that decide local sales taxes. They decide what you can put in the garbage cans, or where you drop your leaves, or how you must maintain your yard, or whether your mom and dad can put that shed in the back, or can you put a pool in, or what kind of fence you need to have around that pool. So many things that dictate your local lives are controlled by people who are elected at the local levels, and people don't really pay attention to them. So a federal system means that we have shared powers constitutionally between the national level and the local level. Now, we talked earlier about dual federalism and cooperative federalism. Do you guys remember that? Layer cake, marble cake. It used to be very clear. These are the things that the federal government does. They coin money. They have a military, right? They deal with foreign governments. The state, they're in charge of schooling, roads. All of that got kind of mixed up. When did we move from a dual federalism to a cooperative federalism? Right, from the modern presidency on, from the New Deal on, we started to see the national government get involved in all kinds of things that were prior maintained by your local government, your state governments. So we've already talked about the ways in which the national government has incentives, the federal incentives to states to behave certain ways. So the federal government has kind of wrenched people's arms behind their back, states behind their back to do what they wanted. When did this start? And when did the national government begin to grow? Zach mentioned after the New Deal and FDR and the Second World War, when we started having what's called withholdings. April 15th is coming up, but it used to be on April 15th, everybody paid their federal income taxes and they wrote a check for it. No one does that, right? They keep it from your paycheck and you don't even think the money's yours. That's why every time tax money comes around and people say, yay, I'm getting money from the government. No, you're not. You just lent the government your money for a year, interest-free, and now they're giving it back to you. So if you're getting a refund on your taxes, it's because you gave the US government a tax-free, an interest-free loan for a year. But that's the way people see it, whereas before, when you paid your taxes on the 15th of the month, the federal government was much smaller. So as the federal government was able to raise taxes and grow, then they could try to manipulate states to do what they wanted them to do. And they do that via these grants. And you might remember the de Tocqueville quote that says the United States government will be stay in place and be effective as long until the government realizes they can bribe the people with their own money or something. I can't remember the exact quote. We had a discussion question on it earlier in the year. But this is the same sort of thing. Here you've got the federal government, the national government taking money and then giving it back to the states if they behave in a certain way. So categorical grants, block grants, and unfunded mandates. Now we remember unfunded mandates are you must do this, but there's no money for it. A great example of an unfunded mandate that's caused a lot of problems is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Started off as a great idea, grew into a gargantuan program that made a lot of requirements and no money to go behind that. A block grant is when the federal government gives states, a general purpose, hey, we want you to fix roads or whatever. And categorical grants are provided for more specific purposes. People in the national government, they like categorical grants because then they can take credit for something. The states and localities would rather have block grants and decide what's best for them. So with all these school shootings that are going on, the federal government might say, we're going to give you a categorical grant. We want everybody to put in a metal detector in the school. And people in rural Pennsylvania are like, I knew every single kid and every single family in the school. I know everybody who walks through the door. What in the world? Why would I need a metal detector? We don't need that. Give us a block grant and let us decide what we need for security. So that's sort of where those differences happen. You guys have seen cooperative federalism and dual federalism earlier in the year and categorical block and unfunded mandates. Does everybody remember what those are? Now, this also deals with the complexity of state politics is different in different places, and how it's fashioned and what it looks like and its culture are different. I'm not going to really go deeply into this idea of this moralistic, individualistic culture, traditional culture, but what we know is when all of our states were settled, they came from different areas in Europe and they created a different culture based on the ideals of that group. And so the political culture looked very different as well. How much should people be involved in politics? Who should be involved? How much should the government get involved in people's life? So when we think about upper Midwest, Pacific Northwest, and New England, this is encourages a lot of civic participation, looks at lots of sort of substantive guarantees and trying to fix people's problems, whereas the Mid-Atlantic, Lower Atlantic, West Coast, more individualistic, they kind of expect corruption, don't really think people are going to participate, and sort of live and let live culture. And then in the South and Southwest is really traditionalistic. Certain people are in the social elites, they're in politics, they're the ones that are going to run things, and that's not necessarily going to change over time, and it's just sort of accepted. So different political cultures leads to different level of participation, different levels of accepted corruptions. We see this differently between rural areas and cities. When we look at a lot of political corruption, we can look at New York, Chicago, but I have to tell you, getting involved in local politics here in Lancaster County, what would seem like a very moral society, deeply rooted in an Amish and Mennonite tradition, very traditional area, has a lot of political corruption in its local politics as well. So if you see that in all these places, it does bring you back to what Madison said at the very beginning, that you have ambitious men involved in politics, you're going to have corruption, and you need to have ambition countering ambition. But different levels of political culture lead to different levels of participation, different expectations in terms of what the party might be doing for them, and how involved they're going to get beyond just voting. So every single state has their own constitution, and some states, you think about our national constitution, our federal constitution, And then state constitutions, some state constitutions are gargantuan. I mean, you can sit down and read our Constitution in 30 minutes. You cannot read a lot of state constitutions in 30 minutes. And each state has some differences. Like some states have what's called super legislation, where somebody really wants to make sure this happens in a certain way, so they put it in the Constitution to make it harder to undo. And in the current abortion debates that are going on, you see a lot of states getting involved in passing laws to sort of guard themselves or hedge against what might happen if Roe v. Wade gets overturned. So some states have short, succinct constitutions that provide a general guideline. Others can be deeply complicated and massive. In every state, when you think about its constitution, you need to think about all the rest of the areas of the state. Every state does things differently. So yes, every state has an executive, a governor. Every state has some form of a legislature, most of them bicameral, some of them unicameral. And every state has a judiciary, but how those things come about is different in different places. So in Pennsylvania, for instance, we do elect our judges. They're elected for 10-year terms, and after 10 years, they're just voted to be retained. So we're either going to keep them or not keep them after 10 years. But there's no one runs against that seat. They're either retained or not retained. So you're not constantly politicking, and after you get elected as a judge, the expectation is that you get out of politics. You stay uninvolved in those things. But judge races are still very political in Pennsylvania and other places where you have these kind of elections, because what happens on the bench matters. You know, we have a constitutional court and a superior court, so that appellate court level is broken up in our state. In the Supreme Court, the last Supreme Court race in Pennsylvania, more money was spent on that judicial race than any judicial race in the history of the United States of America. Why? Why do you think that that judicial case might matter very much? Because of gerrymandering and the redrawing of maps. So all of those things matter politically and come back down to who has political power, when, where, how is that distributed. And what that looks like at the local level changes as well from state to state. So there has been some constitutional and democratic reforms, moves towards some direct democracies. When we look at states like California, they do a lot of referendums where people vote in initiatives on things directly. One of the famous ones was Proposition 8, which was a movement to keep marriage defined as between a man and a woman. It passed in California, believe it or not, but got overturned. A recall is trying to remove somebody from office. So recently in Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker was called up on a recall. He lived through his recall. He recently lost in an election, but he survived that recall election. But those are ways where there's a movement towards more direct democracy. In some of the other current reforms that we see, a stronger state government. So it's always a hard balance. You know, Pennsylvania has a legislature that's full-time. They meet all the time. They're paid very well. We have a strong governor. And the benefits to that is, allegedly, it's supposed to be more efficient. Then you have a state like Texas, where their legislature meets once a year, and it's like less than 3 months, I think. They can only propose new legislation every other year. On the off years, we're just writing a budget. They're part-time legislature, and a lot of people feel like, well, that at least controls them, right? First, do no harm. But when you have a weak legislature, you give a lot more power to the bureaucracy that's there doing the day-to-day business of running the government, because they're there all the time. So if you're a part-time legislature, then they can say, we'll just wait you out. So it's always a trade-off, you know. I mean, certainly we see the bureaucracy and our elected officials becoming stronger and more entrenched in people's lives around the whole country. And governors used to be kind of like the fun mayor that were in parades and the face of the state, and we called good time Charlies. They just sort of were good to be around and glad handing, but they didn't really do much. We don't really have good time Charlie governors anymore. Our governors are pretty strong political forces, and being a governor of a state is a huge stepping stone to other executive positions, like to run for the president. So more of a move away from citizen to professional legislatures, more efficient state governments allegedly, and certainly stronger state governments. But it takes money to run all of those things. As people have moved into cities, we see stronger urban power, and sort of your rural areas sort of missing out. Now, if we had a lot of time to talk about how we fund schools and the functioning of school boards and local governments, you'll see how it becomes quite difficult for rural areas to be able to fund the things that they need in order to function, because there's a lot less people living in those areas. Now, some of that has changed as people are working from home more, so we might see that pendulum swing back the other way. And legislatures are really supposed to be there, represent the public policy interests, and address issues that were supposed to be addressed by the states and controlled by the states. When we look at state power and then we look at local government power, it's important to remember that your local government makes a lot of decisions for you as well. That power is devolved power. So your mayors, your city councilors, your township managers, your county commissioners, they all work under a mandate or an edict from the state. So the state can take that back. Do they take that back? Sometimes the city of Harrisburg, which is the capital of Pennsylvania, went broke, and the state threatened to take over the city and take over its finances. So they can do that. So I talked a little bit about good time Charlies already, and a move towards more professional governments and people with stronger executive experience. Now, every state does things differently. When we look at the federal government and the running of the bureaucracy, you have the president, Donald Trump, and then he appoints his Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, right? Attorney General. So everybody who's in those positions, even though the White House staff and the executive office of the president might have some tension with the people who are sitting in those other offices, they're at least all aligned politically. A lot of states don't have those positions as appointed positions. Rather, they're elected positions. So you might have a lieutenant governor who's from a different political party. You might have a secretary of state or attorney general that's from a different party. And then they don't always work well together, right? They don't always work in concert because they have some different political agendas or policy agendas. So it can become a little bit more difficult for that governor to functionally run a cabinet if you have people in your cabinet who are actively working against you. I'm not really sure how I feel about it. Like a couple years ago, we had a Attorney General, Catherine Kane was her name, and she got arrested, and she's in jail now. But I mean, she did a lot of damage during the last governor. They were from opposing parties. During the last governor's reign, because she was actively working against him and working against his political party, and so it became quite difficult. Now, I mentioned state courts. And when we talked about the court system, there's a lot of different court systems, okay? So you have your federal court system, which is made up of your district courts, your appellate court, and your Supreme Court, right? Then you have state courts, and then you have local courts or magisterial courts. And, often you have law enforcement in the sheriff and county courts and county law enforcement, state courts, state enforcement. So every state runs those things differently, and how that power is shared out is different. So this is why sometimes it can get tricky of who has jurisdiction. State courts are involved in a lot of things, both civil and criminal. When you think about like the Court of Common Pleas, which is what we call our sort of lower level courts, they're going to do murder trials, drug trials, burglary, all of those kinds of things, corruption on the state and local level, but they're also going to do divorces, adoptions, loss of parental rights, suits between two businesses. We just had a big court case here where a kid in a neighboring district got expelled, and that went to the Court of Common Pleas, and the judge reversed it, saying his constitutional rights had been violated. So the state court system is normally unified and organized and managed, and it may look just like the federal system or it may not. It depends on the state in which you live in. So you might have people elected, you might have judges appointed, you might have them elected like we do and then just held for retainer. You might have a lot of different ways in which you get those justices put in place. And like I said, in Pennsylvania, we have the Court of Common Pleas, and then we have the Superior Court and what's called the Constitutional Court, and then the Supreme Court. So at that appellate court level, we divide that up with things that have a constitutional question and things that are a matter of other law, so criminal or civil cases. And elections versus non-elections for the judiciary, you know, there's pluses and minuses on both sides. The Pennsylvania courts, I would say, are pretty politicized, which is really unfortunate. Not necessarily at the local level, but at the Supreme Court level, they are, the state Supreme Court. So then you all live in different areas. Some of you probably live in a county. Some of you live in towns. I live in East Lampeter Township. There's boroughs, there's hamlets, all kinds of different things. Who lives in a city, and do you have a mayor? Does someone live in a township and have township supervisors? You live in a city and you have a mayor. And there's two different kinds of mayors. There's what's called a strong mayor or a weak mayor. A weak mayor is usually in a small town or a small city where you have, you know, a couple thousand people, and the mayor's there for parades and some guidance. Where you have in like a strong city or a large city like Lancaster County, in the city, Lancaster City, that's a full-time mayor position, and that mayor position is paid. So mayor on its face, you know, the mayor of the next town over, New Holland Borough, it's actually a borough, he's a weak mayor, and it's more of a political position than any real authority, versus the mayor of New York City is running and managing a city that's bigger than most states in the United States. So it depends on where you're at. Yeah, you have if you have 120,000 people in your city, I'm sure you have a strong mayor. And weak versus strong basically means paid versus unpaid, or is it run by the city council, or is the mayor actually like the CEO? So Zach, you have county commissioners, we do that too. But then you also have township supervisors. So I live in Lancaster County, but I live in East Lampeter Township. So the commissioners have taxes. They deal with assessing property values, running the prison, all kinds of things like that control the county and county roads and county police, and a sheriff is an elected position all in the county. But then in East Lampeter Township, we have 3 supervisors. They decide on building permits, waste disposal, maintaining those city roads or township roads, cops, fire department, you know, all that kind of stuff. So liquor licenses, can a business sell alcohol, etc. So like I mentioned earlier, localities don't have a constitutional status. Their power is devolved from the state. The states are the ones with the power. The state and the national government have shared power. And some states allow large cities, like in my case, Philly and Pittsburgh, to totally govern themselves. But a mayoral government is a government like Yaya mentioned that they have. Usually this is a partisan election. You've got city councilor, the mayors and the city councilors may or may not be from the same party. I gave you guys that clip to watch last week from Parks and Rec. Has anyone ever seen that show? Ron Swanson, nobody's ever watched Parks and Recreation before? Am I really that old? Oh my word, it's a really funny sitcom. So Ron Swanson, the guy that you looked at the little link from, he's the libertarian, and his deputy, Amy Poehler, is like, thinks government's gonna solve all problems. And they're really funny together, running the Parks Department. So a city council manager is where you've got a full-time person who's doing the business of running the government, and then you have a weak mayor who's going to come in there and kind of provide guidance, but not really the one that's making the decisions on a day-to-day basis. And then a commission is usually three, a commission of three. So in Lancaster County, there's always one who's from the minority party and two from the majority party. And then there's other forms of government as well. So, when we talk about suburban and suburban sprawl, a lot of money moved into suburbs and out of urban areas. There's a lot of urban revitalization that's going on around the country. A lot of people have looked at how could we have a metropolitan-wide government that perhaps went through the whole county, looked at these townships, and the city is one large entity. Cities tend to like that because they're usually poorer. The suburbs don't, because they feel like you're taking our money and sending it back into other areas, and it's a Robin Hood kind of scheme. So they're sort of back and forth. Now, besides your here's your president, your Senate, and your House of Representatives, here's your governor, and then we have a legislative, we don't call it the House of Representatives, we call it the legislature and the Senate in Pennsylvania, and you've got your judges here, and you've got your judges here, and then you've got your local mayor or township supervisors or county commissioners, and all of those people are part of what's governing you. There's also all kinds of other people who are governing you. Some of them are appointed, and some of them are elected. So I serve on the school board. That's a devolved power, but I'm elected. I'm elected with a specific mandate of governing that school district in terms of the education of the citizens here. You've got other people like elected row officers. Maybe someone is a prothonotary or a clerk of courts or the register of wills or the sheriff. Those are all local elected positions that people are like, what? We elect the person who records the deeds in the courthouse? Yes, we do. And we have elected people who record the wills and record the business of the court. And we have people who are elected that are the county sheriff. And you've got elections for school board members and township supervisors. And then some of those other positions, we call those row offices. Some of the other positions that we see are appointed positions to the Parks Board or the Sewer Board or the Water Board. We recently did a tax incentive program to improve some roads in East Lampeter Township. So there's a board that's overseeing what's called the TIP, or the Tax Incentive Plan. So there's all kinds of other people who govern when your park is open, if the dog can come to the park. Are we going to put in a new walking trail? How is stormwater managed? What are we going to do about runoff? How about the Chesapeake Bay? You know, just on and on and on, that would make your head spin if you thought of all the other state and local arenas where you have government officials involved. And there's a lot of intergovernment cooperation as well. Now, if you remember when we talked about interest groups and lobbying organizations, the National Government Association, Governors Association, and the Council of State Legislature, all of these are big lobbying institutions, right? They're involved in federal government. They want to have a relationship with the federal government to say, look, where are you controlling, manipulating, or writing laws that are really going to impact us? Then there's these things called interstate compacts, and this is an agreement between states to provide reciprocity or commonly manage something. If you are in Michigan and Wisconsin, you both border Lake Michigan. If you're in Wisconsin or Minnesota, you both border Lake Superior. How are we going to manage that waterway? What are we going to do about pollution? How are we going to handle boats, ships, logistics on that lake? All of those things have to happen with interstate compacts and agreements between the two states to share that common resource. The other area where you see interstate compacts is often with college tuition. So when I lived in Minnesota, if you wanted to go to college in Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, or South Dakota, you could go to any of those schools and get in-state tuition. So they had what was called reciprocity, or if your students want to come here, we'll let them have in-state, and you let ours go there and they have in-state. And so that was a great benefit to students in that area, that 1, 2, 3, 4 state area. I think Iowa was involved too, 5 state area. Because you could go to any of those places for colleges, and they brought students in from other areas as well. All of those things would fall under this idea of an interstate compact. So state and local governments often compete. They compete because there's different benefits of living in certain places, and there's different tax incentives. When I moved from Texas to Pennsylvania, the average cost of living went up by 30%. Because Pennsylvania, oh my word, I can't believe I'm yawning in the afternoon. Pennsylvania has loads of taxes and all kinds of regulations and things that are really expensive here. So the mobility of people, and I'll give you a great example. If you wanted to open up a restaurant in East Lampeter Township or Upper Leacock Township in the county of Lancaster in the state of Pennsylvania, and you wanted to have liquor in your restaurant, you'd have to get a liquor license. What do you think it might cost in Pennsylvania to get a liquor license? First of all, they're very tightly controlled, so sometimes you can't even get them. But if you want to get one, it's somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000. Because if you're buying it from somebody else, it's an outrageous amount of money. I know, right? My son-in-law just applied for a liquor license to have beer in his barbecue restaurant in West Texas in Abilene. So he had to go down to the county courthouse, fill out some paperwork, wait 2 months, and pay what? What do you think it costs to have beer and wine in your restaurant in Texas? Yes, $650. I mean, just think about that, right? That's a major difference. So when you look at states, when you say, what does it cost? I do love Texas too. What does it cost to do business here? What does it cost to raise a family here? And when businesses, we've all kind of paid attention to Amazon recently opening up warehouses, but it's much easier for businesses to move their headquarters now, even moving them out of the United States. With the old corporate tax laws under the Obama administration, so we had companies moving to Finland to avoid our corporate tax rate. That's crazy, right? Finland's supposed to be socialists. That they actually had lower corporate tax rates than we had in the United States. And then you've got them moving from state to state, depending upon what are the benefits of living there Can I get people to move there? Can I recruit? Is there good human capital, people to hire? What are the schools like? And what does it cost to do business there? What are you going to charge me in taxes? And so sometimes you have people competing, and you have what's called the race to the bottom, or we want to cut spending, cut spending, cut spending to keep tax rates low. And the next thing you know, we have no social welfare programs. Our schools are poorly funded. We've got environmental issues, etc. This is where competition can get a little out of control. But you also can see situations where, like, people were competing to get Amazon to come into their area, and it becomes a situation of what's called crony capitalism. Or if Amazon comes in, we're going to give them all these benefits because they're going to bring jobs in, benefits that cost the taxpayers about $45,000 per job. You're like, well, wait a minute, that's not fair to Best Buy, or that's not fair to, you know, Joe Bag of Donuts' hardware store down the street, because they're not getting that same benefit. And that's where you see crony capitalism, or the government kind of choosing winners and losers of who they're going to give tax breaks to try to entice them into this area. But competition among states is a serious issue now, especially as people are moving and can move around. Rick Perry, when he was the governor of Pennsylvania, took a full page ad out in the New York Times and said, move your business to Texas. We've got room. It's cheap. Our taxes are low. I mean, it was an absolute poke in the eye at Andrew Cuomo. I think was still the governor then. I think it's his first name. It's his Mario Cuomo's son, Governor Cuomo, and Michael Bloomberg. It was a direct kind of hit at them, because it's really expensive to do business in New York. Lots and lots of taxes in New York. So, you know, there you see these examples of where competition is happening between states. Sometimes that leads to efficiencies, and it's really, really a good thing. Other times it becomes crony capitalism, because you get the federal or the national, the state government really wanting someone to come into your area, or a local government really wanting someone to come to the area and be willing to give them tax breaks that make competition slightly unfair for other people. So it's all a very difficult balancing act between states, municipalities, counties, all of those things, which have a huge impact on your life. People don't go to township supervisor meetings unless they're trying to get a permit to build something. They don't go to school boards unless they're scared their taxes are going to be raised, or someone got expelled that they know, or something like that. So people don't pay attention to all of these local governing officials that have a huge role in your day-to-day life. And it's really why, under a federal system like we have in the United States, the state and local government really do matter. And it's the reason why I didn't feel like we could leave it out of our study of US government. So that brings us to finishing a little bit early today. Do you guys have questions about local government? I know you might be thinking, I don't have an exam on this, but it still does really matter. Did we skip? No, never mind. I'll look. Did you guys read chapter 16 already? Did I skip chapter 16, social and environmental policy? We're reading, okay. Oh, good. All right, so I'm not ahead of I'm behind myself. So we've got 16, 17, and 18 still. Good. I just all of a sudden had oh my word, I skipped a whole chapter. Yeah, I should have an answer to that today or tomorrow, Zach. I'm going to try to get that all open. As soon as the committee part starts, no one else can write their bills. So I'm going to have probably a slop week to let anybody do some cleanup. All right. Sorry we're ending earlier. We always end late, but I did want to make sure we were not ignoring local government, and that you guys understand it, feel like you have an understanding of the federal nature of the United States of America. And we'll be back to talk about policies next week. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you later.